everyone. This webinar is going to be a little bit different. This is our chat. I want to say hi to everyone. This is Fun and Casual. We're supposed to have attendee questions that Bruce, our moderator, will talk about. We're giving away 3 free 2-day passes to Uplux's fabulous global office spaces on demand workspaces that set your teams free. We're giving away books by Rick Costa. And we want to thank our supporters and our friends who've been with us. We think there might be some technical problems. So some of our other panelists might not be here, but we're still going to go through and answer some of the questions with our 2 fabulous panelists, Esther and Amy. And we want to thank Ramona Wright, Esther Dyson, Scott Moss, Zeotag, David Soren for all their support. And I'm going to introduce you to Bruce, our moderator. Bruce is the AI content expert, and he will let you know what's going on. Oh, there's Mark. Mark is from Germany, so we have to give him a little bye time. He's a little bit off time-wise. I think it's 9 o'clock there, right?
Yep, that's right.
Yeah,
Yep.
So it's not that late. You should be awake. You should be drinking coffee. Anyway, thanks everyone for coming, and enjoy. Bruce, go for it.
Okay, thanks, Lauren, and welcome everyone. And so I'd like to start, first of all, as Lauren said, this is a more informal event than the panel that we ran last week. So I'd like to invite each of our panelists to introduce themselves in a few sentences. What do they do, and in particular, why are they here for this discussion about helping the unbanked? So I'll just go in alphabetical order of first name. So Amy, you can be first.
Thank you. Hi everybody. My name is Amy Young. I am an industry digital strategist at Microsoft, and my role is to work with our largest enterprise customers on their innovation agendas. And it's a departure from Microsoft's historic operating model where we focus more on IT relationships. My mandate is to work with the business to understand the business's strategic priorities. In terms of this particular topic, many of my clients, all of my clients, are working on various things, to raise their social quotient in many respects. Addressing financial well-being broadly is pretty much always part of that, and the kinds of things that lead to the problem of being unbanked or underbanked really are not that dissimilar to the problems that we see, in financial wellness in every respect, right? It's about friction. It's about, cognitive biases. It's about, fear, lack of trust, just humanity. And so I'm fascinated to be part of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Esther, well, speaking of wellness, Esther, you can introduce yourself.
Okay. I'm Esther Dyson, a former techie, and now trying to figure out where the camera is so I can look at you. I am interested in the topic because I started something called Wellville back in 2014, which is focused on 5 small US communities and helping them to become healthier and more equitable. And obviously a huge part of their problems originate with a shortage of money, which leads to a shortage of everything else, including time and the ability to live a healthy life. So the unbanked part is both part of the result and part of the cause of just a lot of people who fail to live up to their potential because they get underserved as kids, they become unhealthy, they don't get enough schooling, and they're surrounded by an environment that makes things difficult. Some of them are extremely resilient and do very well, but many of them, as I said, just don't live up to their potential. I'm also an investor in a company called The Beans, which is an app not to help you count your money, but more to help you think about your money, because it's the best thing I can do on this topic is recommend a book called Scarcity, about the parallels between the scarcity of money for poor people and the scarcity of time for rich people, which makes both of them do really stupid things.
Thank you, Esther. We'll come back to some of those topics as we go along. Mark?
Yeah, so my name is Mark Mattingly Scott. I'm actually located in Germany. I'm a British guy by birth, and the topic of, as you refer to it in the US, the unbanked, has a personal touch for me, particularly in my very, very early childhood. I came out of an environment where that was reality, so I'm very aware of what it feels like. I think the challenge is that the unbanked people who are unbanked are, I mean, in the US, there are very particular sociographic, demographic reasons why that happens. If you look in the broader context around the rest of the world, there are some pretty clear indicators for why people are unbanked, where and why, and categories those fall into. For me, it's a very strong aspect of this is aspects of discrimination, social aspects, and my hope, and particularly where I hope that maybe technology can make even a small difference, is in throwing some light on why that is the case, making some of the hidden things, the hidden forces, the hidden categories, the hidden reasons, making some of those transparent by working with data, by understanding completely transparently what it is that causes this, and what can we do specifically to help people in very, very specific situations. In other words, not trying to boil the ocean, but trying to make a small difference. So I have a personal connection, and also a kind of wish, a kind of destination where I'd like to get to.
Great, thanks. And in fact, in general, given that the last week's webinar talked a lot about the causes and about many of the social factors that you've alluded to, Mark, about why people are unbanked, I'd like to spend this time together today talking about, well, okay, given all of that, what might we do? And I'd actually like to start with something that's very personal, and something that Amy said last week that I'd like to follow up on. As she was describing her daughter's challenges about getting banked, it made me think of my own daughter, who's probably just a few years older than Amy's daughter, who herself was quite literally homeless for a while, but she still had a debit card linked to an account that had been opened when she was a child. Otherwise, she would not have had any banking access at all. And Amy's daughter, who, as I recall, also had similar situations of not having a stable address in order to open an account. How do we reach people like that? Let's start with that one. How can we get access to financial systems for people I don't want to overgeneralize, but it seems that young people today are much less tied to setting down roots than previous generations, although maybe it's just that we didn't notice it in previous times. How can we address people like that? Esther?
I mean, there's a bunch of problems here, and it's like maybe being unbanked is not their first problem. Being unhoused and not being reachable. I mean, you ask, how can we reach them? And one of the problems is they might not have an ID. They might not have a residence somewhere, so they can't get vaccinated in the state they're living in the current situation. They don't have access to health care. So it's all the affordances of life, not just the banking. And if they have no address, how could a prospective employer reach them? How could a check reach them? So it's, and you asked, how do we help? Well, it's a wraparound kind of thing. You bring them in, you help them get an ID, you help them get, whether it's Medicaid, or you help them get a bank account, you help them get a place where they can receive whatever it is they might receive. And then ideally you help them get a job, or you help them get training to get a job. And, and honestly, so many people become homeless because of various mental health issues, which are due to trauma. And so, you want to deal with that as well. And they become homeless because they don't trust anybody. They don't want to live in a homeless shelter with other people they don't trust. Whatever they've got, they don't want it to be stolen. So it's kind of unpeeling a lot of different challenges, and it's going to be different person to person, but you need someone who understands all these challenges to know where to start.
Just occurred to me, we have all of this, we tend to go right to education, whether it's about financial literacy, various other things. But so much of, I was reading an article after last week's talk about this agency in Ontario, where I'm from, that partners working class people with impoverished people. And the idea is, that to reduce the distance between them. And they've created a model where it's not even positioned as the working class person helping, because there's some condescension there. It's a partnership. And there was a quote from one of the homeless guys that was part of the program, where he said, I go to the welfare office and all they do is tell me what I should do. This was the first time anybody ever asked me what mattered to me. And so I think part of the problem with all of these conditions, and I couldn't agree with Esther more. I mean, this isn't about unbanked, it's about unhoused, uneducated, unhealthy, on all of it, right? And I don't know where you start, but there's this inherent judgment pretty much everywhere you go. And candidly, in the case between my husband and I and our daughter, those conversations tend to be pretty steeped in judgment for her poor choice, but my perception of her poor choices. But I wonder if the place to start, she spends countless hours, on things like TikTok and YouTube and whatever else. We have, social media personalities who tell you how to do your makeup and how to dress and do your hair and all this other nonsense. What if there was a social media personality who told you just how to get your shit together, right? And from the perspective of someone who has walked in those shoes, right? The ID problem is often one of the critical things. If you don't have an address, here's how you can go. Here's what I did. Here's how I, here's how I felt And here's what helped me cross that bridge, but it has to be from someone, you know, an authentic person who has been there and can say it without judgment. But go where the users are. And we always say, you got to go where your customers are, go to your customer. Well, my kid spends time on those kinds of social media platforms, and if there was the right kind of content, that might resonate with her.
Actually, I'd like to follow up on that and just say that maybe I think even considering just the so-called homeless population, there's different subcategories, because what Amy just described, and my daughter was in the same situation. She had a phone, and she may have been one of the few homeless people for whom the only piece of ID she had was a passport. So her case was
until it expires. We went through that.
That's right, until it expires. So there's some cases where it's not education in the sense of basic skills, but more of now you're homeless, now what you do. And I also want pro tip, by the way, the state of Massachusetts will allow homeless people to enroll on their healthcare system, because my daughter was able to do it using her passport as her ID, which they said that was actually more common than we imagined. Anyway, but so there's one part of the homeless population that has phones. So is there some way we can leverage their access? They do have access to something somehow. Mark, any thoughts?
Well, just while we've been talking, I've just been researching the use of social media to address awareness and to provide support. It does appear that this is a thing, but of course, half the accounts I'm reading are about abuse. In other words, people abusing this. I think the level of technology and the type of technology that an individual has, and let's be honest, the kind of the lowest level is absolutely no proof of identity, all the way up to having a passport or owning a mobile phone or some kind of ID file, ID card, or in the US a driver's license, I guess, or a social security number. I think technology now is so advanced that being agnostic to the kind of identity or the idea of a specific identity, legal identity, and how you verify that, how you maintain that. Technology is far enough that we can be pretty flexible about how that's captured, how that's carried forward, how that's actually used, and whether it's used. There's also, there are, not the US, but there are other countries out there where this flexible use of technology has led to a massive reduction in the number of unbanked. In India, for example, although there are some other problems in India, but so it is possible, and the technological capabilities and possibilities we have are certainly more than adequate to address it. We just have to, and this came up in the discussion last week. Where do you start? And if I remember correctly, one of the points was one good place to start is in the interactions between an individual and the state, whatever form that is, doing things in relation to the state, registering events, claiming some kind of benefits, support. If you make all those things contingent on having a bank account and provide proactive support to make that happen, that's going to be a huge help, going to make a huge difference. but as I say, the technology to do that, I don't think that's the challenge.
Esther,
Yeah, I
you've been
think-
wanting, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can talk all day long about there's all these different approaches and these different kinds of technology, but the challenge is a very different challenge. It's actually reaching people and getting them to want the help. You know, I mean, I would argue probably the best place to go to find them and help them is food banks. You know, because the one thing they can't survive without for too long is food. But it's just, I mean, there's that. This is how you actually reach them. At the other end, how do you help solve the problem? You create a government and a collective understanding that people need to be taken care of. And we've kind of lost that. I mean, I think of having dinner with Narayana Murthy, who's one of the richest people in India. And he told me how when he was growing up in his family, they just invited all the poor people to dinner. And, you know, that was just understood. If you had food and there were hungry neighbors, you fed them. And, you know, it's very scalable in a small community. It's not so scalable when you become a large bureaucratic world that runs on technology and transactions. But somewhere between those two very simple ideas, we need to connect a society that pays to provide the basics of education. And, you know, we can argue about universal basic income, but at least education, schooling, healthcare, mental health care, etc. And then technology is just, you know, a handy tool to implement a bunch of that.
Yeah, I'd like actually to bring up the case. As many of you know, I lived for over 20 years in France, which is why my daughter has a passport. And they took a look at their unbanked problem. I'm going to say this was, well, first of all, many, many years ago, several decades ago. They looked at it and they said, well, let's let the post office be a bank, because there's a post office, or at least there had been, they've been closing smaller branches too, but there had been a post office in every village in the entire country. And so there was at least access to the financial system available. And then when that was not enough, they then allowed the tobacconists to sell debit cards as a way to allow people who didn't have a bank account to have access to electronic funds of some sort. Again, it's there's tobacco shops everywhere. Many of them are also cafes or bars, and it's hard to find a spot anywhere in the country where there isn't either a post office or a tobacconist. But the key point was the authorities, with the agreement of the financial industry, used the technology that was already available and made a concerted effort to reach everybody. So I think we've been discussing that in various ways as well. There needs to be an impetus somehow. Amy, Mark, would you care to weigh in?
I mean, so I remember my final comment last week was around the importance of some elegant policy and product design around this. And when I listened to the examples you gave about France, there's certainly elements of that, right? They started to think about, okay, what infrastructure is there? Where do people already go? Like, where are the people? Where do they go? Who do they engage with? Particularly the tobacconist component. And, you know, I think that's what this is about. I mean, Esther mentioned food banks. I mean, it's plugging, like great product design is about plugging into things that people already do and helping them get more value out of those interactions to solve other problems with a muscle that you already have. Building a completely new muscle is much, much, much harder. You know, it's the reason why cross-selling a customer is way easier and cheaper than it is to get a new customer, right? There's so much evidence of this. It's, you know, it's kind of, you can't argue it. The question is, what are some of the best places to do this? And then what are the incentives of whatever stakeholders you're talking about to collaborate on this? Like, I remember when I was I did some work for the Canada Student Loan Program when I was running my own consulting practice a few years back. And we were, you know, did a lot of work on financial literacy, and we talked about, so that was a great opportunity because kids that wanted to get the money, you could make them sign up for an app and, you know, use the data you have about their education journey to pre-populate a budget, and you can send them nudges about how their money's being spent. And, you know, because you're the gatekeeper, it's like, if you want this, you have to do this. And it doesn't even have to sound like carrots and sticks, but just this is the process, right? And I think we have to find other things like that. When we talked about, when we talk about financial literacy in schools, the idea that I had was that we should, you know, kids should have to do projects about their own bank's budgeting app. Like, in this day and age, every kid has, you know, every kid, you know, not hugely marginalized kid has a phone and has some kind of bank account. And all of those banks have some kind of a budgeting app, or if the bank doesn't, there's third-party apps. So you should have to do a project in school about your observations of the tool that is already available to you, right? But then it gets into, you know, is the school then endorsing commercial tools? And I mean, I get the governance concerns, but I'm a pragmatist, right? you gotta use what teach people to enhance the utility of the things they're already using.
Mark?
I mean, the only two cultural environments I'm intimately familiar with are the United Kingdom and Germany. There's quite a big contrast there. Just to give you a feeling, in the United Kingdom, it's perfectly possible to live without any form of identification. In Germany, it's impossible to live without any form of identification. So not having an ID card is in Germany, it's illegal, which means, of course, there is an underground of people without any means of identification, but because not having an ID is illegal, those people are outside the judicial and the judicial system. In the UK, perfectly possible. In the UK, and I haven't lived there for a few decades, but I know that the problem of unbanked people is much greater than in Germany. In fact, I mentioned this last week as well, in the European Union, you have a right to a bank account, not a savings account, not a credit account, but to a bank account. I can walk into any bank anywhere in the European Union and open an account, and they can't refuse me. Presupposing that I've demonstrated my identity, of course. That's the little catch. I think, though, coming back to what Esther said, there is behind that is a social contract. And the social contract says that people who have dropped through whatever safety nets society has provided will be taken care of. And that social contract certainly exists in Germany, to a greater or lesser extent in other European Union countries, to a certain extent in the United Kingdom. I can't comment on to what degree that exists in the United States. I think we have a perception here in Europe that it doesn't exist. On the other hand, I sometimes I see Amy shaking her head and presumably in agreement. I'm still hopeful, and I do see that social contract being, at least in certain places in the United States, fulfilled, but then it's very much a local kind of individual initiative thing and not a mandated governmental blanket thing. I think unless you fix that, you really have a major challenge. You're going to have a major challenge addressing the underlying causes of why people are unbanked. So it's a wider issue than just banking. You're right.
So I'm going to take this on a slightly different direction. We are, of course, all here because we share backgrounds and interest in the tech industry. Are we too dependent on technology? Have we lost a sense of humanity that Mark is alluding to? And the reason I'm bringing this up is there was actually a segment on NPR the other day. I happened to be in the car and caught it, where they were talking about this very topic. And the only time tech was mentioned in the entire 1 hour segment was to blame it for making the problem worse instead of helping to alleviate it. And they cited things like algorithms for risk management, and instead of hiding behind know your customer laws as opposed to actually knowing your customer. Esther, you're actually been out on the front lines in the context of Wellville, but I know that you are a proponent of renewing the human touch and human relations. What would you care to expound on this question of, are we actually relying on tech too much?
Yeah, I mean, just to put things in extremely broad context, if we really want to solve all these problems caused by human beings, just kill all the human beings and there will be no problems. Otherwise, let's be human beings and, create a world where human beings are valued and treasured and raised. We talk about training AIs, but we forget to train our babies, and we train them with inadequate parents. I mean, in addition to economic literacy, you need parenting literacy. And because of a lot of social breakdowns, there's a lot of people who have children who are, inadequate as parents, probably because their parents before them were inadequate. And, we need to create a society where somehow we realize it's in our collective interest to care for people, to build a social infrastructure that will support them. And we need to invest in the next generation, which means help people raise the kids, whatever that takes. And then instead of being a burden, they will end up being able to take care of themselves and raise the next generation more effectively. And there's very little technology as a tool that you can do that with. Sometimes it certainly makes the distribution of food or of money much more convenient, but the fundamental decisions are kind of orthogonal. I saw in the chat that somebody was suggesting using Bitcoin, and I'm sorry, but that's not, lack of Bitcoin is not the problem that's making people unbanked. So, you know, how to be more constructive. I mean, I'm just going out and doing this, not personally on the front lines. We're coaches. We're helping people to build their own social infrastructure. But our goal is to help 5 small communities do that effectively, and then to help them become role models and examples and inspirations and evidence that this can work. I mean, it's clear certain things work in the lab, but how to make them work in real communities that have fallen on hard times. That's what we're trying to do. And we're 6 years into a 10-year project, and it's pretty encouraging. We've learned a huge amount. We've probably learned more than the people in the communities have learned. But, you know, people do work together if they have a common purpose, and if they're help to collaborate rather than to compete for scarce resources. One thing that foundations do really poorly is they make all these community organizations compete against one another, when what makes a strong community is when the food bank works closely with the employment agency, and that works with the schools, and the YMCA works with the Goodwill, and they have enough capacity and enough agency that they're happy to share what they've learned, rather than, you know, a society in which everybody is selfish leaves half of the people in despair. A society in which people are successful and generous is what we're trying to create. We're trying to do it on a small scale because it's really hard to do it on a large scale. But if you see it done on a small scale, as our thesis, then maybe you can persuade people to do it more broadly. So it's, you know, this isn't, the financial part can be solved by voters, but the actual implementation part needs to be solved in real communities by real people just behaving better.
So, I mean, I would argue that, I mean, so as you said, technology is a tool. That's kind of the point. Funnily enough, the president of Microsoft wrote a book in the past year called Tools and Weapons, and it's about AI and how it can be a wonderful tool, but it also can be a terrible weapon if misused. And, you know, it's no different than, you know, the head of, you know, a piece of sharpened rock can be used as a tool to dig things, shape things, or it can be used as the head of an arrow or a spear.
Yeah.
So technology is not the problem. It's the priorities that we set and that the technology is used for. And I think to Esther's point about scaling the solution. So yeah, you can make pretty much anything happen in a very small controlled environment. Technology actually has been proven to be an amazing way to scale many things, right? Because you identify patterns, and then you can repeat those patterns. And the technology can often identify the patterns better than we can. Like the whole point about actually know your customer instead of, you know, have the data know your customer. There are biases in both. I'm very clear on that. It's not that magically, you know, the digital KYC is without bias. Its bias is a function of the data and the models that go into it. But, you know, if we design with an eye to bias in technology, I think we can actually do a better job of overcoming it than we can, you know, having individual humans, you know, thousands of individual humans making millions of decisions when we have no idea what biases are driving their behavior. You know, what biases, poor ethics, bad moods, like whatever, right? I mean, when I talk to my customers about, you know, in financial services, you know, there's this maddening debate about, you know, should we focus on our human channels or our digital channels, and is it human or is it digital? And what we don't talk about is in the past, the model was we trained our humans and we upskilled them to let them use so they would have good judgment to make good decisions. And when we do technology, we tend to not think about how you have to do so much more design work because you get exactly what you put in there. There is no judgment, right? You tell it to do X and it does exactly X. And if you don't realize that, your interpretation of X that you told the machine to do might have been too narrow or skewed or incomplete or whatever, we do run some risks there. But that's partly the risk and partly the beauty of technology. If you design it really, really, really well, you can get wonderful things out of it. But we tend to not put enough effort into that. So because we're focused on, before we used to just focus on training people and we let them go do things and use their judgment for better or for worse, right?
And we don't have firsthand experience of some of these problems we're trying to solve. So we don't understand, just what it really is like to live under a bridge.
No, I think that is a core. I mean, in the chat, a few people have mentioned that, having accountants going out and teaching financial literacy, the lesson that people need to learn isn't about the content in the math. Like that, I put that in the chat. Ontario actually does have financial literacy in the curriculum. The point is, the focus of it is about calculations. It's about the math, not about life and making decisions when you're, when the decision often involves delayed gratification or peer pressure or any number of other things that conspire to have us not make the best possible decisions we can, or we're making a decision for the wrong time horizon, right? It might be efficacious for right now, but it bites me from, again and again in the future.
But you may not, but it's things as simple as you can't buy the large packages to save money because you have no place to store them.
Or you don't have the cash for that. Like if you buy the large package of chicken, you can only buy chicken, right? Yeah.
Lauren, it seems like we had, not on this panel, but another panelist that's actually got an app to help people with those kinds of decisions. We might want to just tie that in another time. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of their app. Anyway, Mark, care to weigh in on this this topic?
I think it's the sense of it's a sense of disconnectedness. I mentioned when I introduced myself, I have a biographical reason for understanding, at least as a very, very small, as best you can as a small infant, what it means to be not homeless, but more pretty close to homeless, and certainly unbanked. And of course, I mean, a 1-year-old infant doesn't even know what a bank is, but you know how it feels. You feel the desperateness and fear and existential dread of your parents, of your mother and father. You breathe it, and that kind of, that it's like a brand, or in your skin. It never leaves you, and I'm very, very aware of that. I'm very acutely aware of what separates us here, me, but or the rest of you as well, from somebody who's sleeping under the bridge. And it's not a lot. It's a couple of, maybe a bad decision and a couple of pieces of bad luck, and we'd be there as well. Which then, if you take that to the next, the next logical step in acknowledging that is it's your obligation, damn it, to help those people, because it could just as easily be you. Self-help. I think at that level, the social contract is, at least for people who have some kind of moral orientation, is there. I think the real challenge is scaling that. Now there was somebody, I think somebody posted in the chat the project about growing produce. Esther, you talked about local projects, helping people in the small, in a sense. The real problem is boiling the ocean. It's making that happen on large scale. But we shouldn't forget that one thing that technology is again and again shown itself to be very good at is scaling things. And I think maybe part of the discussion, we're talking here about financial apps and about how do we educate people to open a bank account and this sort of thing. Maybe the technology approach is completely orthogonal to that. Maybe it's about scaling the local social contract in an effective way. I don't know how you do that. I have absolutely no idea what that actually looks like. But maybe we're looking at this the wrong way. Maybe it's actually a different problem. Just my 10 cents, as they say.
And okay, actually, I do want to go there, Esther. I'll come right back to you. I do want to go there because one of the topics that came up last week and has continued to surface in the chat and in other sources is the question of trust. That many of the unbanked population, the demographics that make up the unbanked population, have been let down in the past. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes by disdain, and sometimes it's been unintentional, but in any case, they don't feel that there is this social contract. How do we, and again, remember, we're technologists, not sociologists, although Esther might be, or at the intersection of sociology and technology, how can we regain that trust? Esther, you wanted to?
Yeah, I mean, many of them, they were let down by their parents. I mean, if you look at the medical data and the studies of adverse childhood experiences and things, the real problem is many children their mothers are, and this is pathological and not everybody's like this, just all the disclaimers, but if your mother is on drugs, or she's 17, or she had you because she got unlucky some night and slept with a stranger, I mean, who knows? So she gets this baby, she doesn't know what to do with it, it cries, she reacts badly, the kid grows up not trusting its own mother. It doesn't know whether its mother's going to be in a good mood or a bad mood. The father may or may not be there. I mean, the statistics around if you have a family member who abuses you or who's on drugs or is in prison, your chances of having similar problems are huge. And the correlation is it's scary. And so it's not even they don't trust society. They grew up in a way where they don't trust other people, including their family. And so it's much harder to repair than simply creating a nice technologically based trustworthy society around them. And so again, these problems go quite deep. And so again, I think it goes back to the parents and the environment in which they grow up. And I also want to react quickly to Mark. You're right that there's so little that separates us from the people under the bridge, but the people on the top of the bridge don't know that. They think they got there because they deserve it. They're sure the people under the bridge are lowlifes who did something wrong. And so they don't have that sympathy or empathy that ideally they would have.
So I don't disagree with anything Esther said, but I think there is a specific problem with banks and trust.
Yes, and in addition, yes.
In addition, but I would also point out, and I would imagine Bruce would probably agree with me. I mean, this narrative of the broken family is the root of all problems. I mean, my kid didn't grow up in a broken family. I have 2 kids. One's perfectly normal and fine and functional and in college and, you know, manages her money just fine, and the other one is not. They're 2 years apart, same parents, like it, you know, that was not the situation, and sometimes things just go wrong. So, so that's one thing to be careful of. But one of the narratives that I've heard from my daughter, because she's been so irresponsible with her money, she has credit problems all over the place. So she, you know, so here's, at the age of 18, she was allowed to take out like $5 grand worth of credit and ran them all up. Now, that of course should not be allowed for an 18-year-old who has no credit history and no income. And like, so she created that problem. And then, but she had no idea how credit cards work and how the interest worked. And so she had this problem where, you know, when she did try for a while to start paying it off, and she had a bank account and would put money in it, and bank would take it. And she thought they were, you know, that created the distrust in the bank, because the bank was following its policies, right? But she had no clue what the policies were. So she had abused the system, and the system was punishing her for that. But she didn't understand what she had signed up for, and frankly wasn't interested in understanding. And so the money, she would complain to me how money would just disappear from her account. And so that's why she didn't trust banks. And one of the reasons she would close accounts and try to open them at new places, and ended up unbanked. So the contract, you know, people need to, never mind, it's too obvious. These things have consequences. I mean, I get the empathy and the help, but there has to be some bit of accountability here as well.
And just Amy, you're right. I have people in my own family who've also gotten into problems with addiction and so forth and so on. And it's just, if you have bad parents, the chances are much higher that it can happen in any family.
Of course.
I would even go just one step farther. My daughter actually worked for a bank for 3 years. She knew exactly how all those accounts worked, and still ended up in a massive debt hole. So it's not just education. It's not even upbringing, as Amy pointed out. There are, as Mark said, separating us from the cardboard box under the bridge, a dubious choice or two, and a few bits of bad luck, and any one of us could literally be there. Okay, so there's a question in the chat about banking deserts. We have a few minutes left, and I would maintain, first of all, that it's we can call them banking deserts, but let's be clear that it's not a financial desert, because human ingenuity and free enterprise being what they are, there are financial services available even in the poorest neighborhoods and even in the most rural areas. There are check cashing services, there are payday loan services, but let's talk about bank. Well, yes, they are predator, as somebody has mentioned in the past, but that's the cost. We talked about the cost of poverty, the cost of getting a check cashed if you don't have a bank account is part of the cost of being poor. But so, quick word about how can we address banking deserts, and which there are even in urban areas, banking deserts. I live not far from, don't want to talk about a big city, it's a small city, but there are whole neighborhoods where there are no banks, and they're all in the nice suburbs that surround the urban area. Banking deserts, anyone? Or is that too hard of a problem to address?
Well, I mean, it's not banking deserts, it's banking swamps. They're there, but they're dangerous and full of rattlesnakes, or I don't know, whatever, lizards or water or something.
Yeah.
I actually think that one's easy. I mean, that's where technology can help. It goes much back to much deeper, more social problems than banking deserts.
Okay. I'd also, just to share another anecdote, I was in a conference back in the days when we still met in person for conferences, with a group of financial professionals, in fact, in the room, who were flabbergasted to discover that many people got their cash not at ATMs or at bank branches, but by choosing the cash back option at the supermarket, which was something that's been around for quite a long time. So I know actually in some neighborhoods, the supermarket is the only financial institution. And maybe, again, this might be a case where awareness could help people understand that actually they could use their supermarket if they have one. There are food deserts as well, as somebody has pointed out in the chat. So 3:56. Last thoughts once around before we close, and this time I'll go reverse order. Mark, last thoughts?
Yeah, I think we need to reframe and somebody made a point in the chat about saying unbanked is actually puts the idea of a bank and a bank account, gives it a value which maybe it doesn't have. It's deeper than that. I think the root cause of the problem, things like the social contract, reframing this in terms of something that technology is actually very good at scaling things. I think that might be a very interesting avenue to pursue. Yeah.
Thanks. Esther?
Yeah, thank you. It's like, it's so easy to talk about the problems and the solutions. They actually all make sense. We just need to go out and do them. And it's not easy, but I'm one of the happiest people I know because I have purpose.
And Amy?
So Bill Gates famously said 20 odd years ago that people don't need banks, they need banking. And I think if we focused on that, what are the services that people need to, help make their lives a little easier, more affordable, secure, be able to, have, poor people. One of the problems that my daughter experienced repeatedly was when you live in cash gets stolen, cash gets lost. How do we? So focus on the underlying services and figure out the best place to integrate them into people's lives, whether it's the supermarket, the tobacconist, the welfare office, whatever.
And also, just the last thought for me, let's remember also that we use the word bank with a small b, not necessarily bank with a capital B, meaning which has specific meanings in certain countries. There are all kinds of other financial institutions, including virtual ones, but even brick and mortar like credit unions and community chests and others that that provide these kinds of services. So for the last hour, when we've talked about bank, it's with the small b, not capital B. So thank you to all the wonderful panelists, Amy, Esther, Mark. Thank you, Lauren, for organizing this. Thank you to all the sponsors for making this possible. And thank you everyone who's been paying attention today or
Commenting.
watching this on the recording. And stay tuned for the next series of interesting, fascinating discussions that will be announced over the summer. Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you.